Ranger Frank was accustomed to the forest's secrets, its rhythm, and its signs. Every day, he walked these familiar paths with his loyal German shepherd, observing the life around him. Yet, on that particular day, a strange tension lingered in the air. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves had faded into a foreboding silence. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that Frank couldn't quite grasp. As he walked deeper into the woods, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut. His German shepherd, usually bounding ahead, slowed and began to sniff the air, its body tense and alert. Frank knew his dog's instincts were rarely wrong. They had saved him countless times from dangerous situations. Whatever was causing this silence wasn't far. They continued onward until they reached a towering old tree that housed a large bird's nest. This tree was a landmark on Frank's daily patrol, a place of life and activity, with birds flitting about, reinforcing their nest and feeding their young. But today, the tree was lifeless. The nest that once thrived with chirping sounds was now hauntingly still. The stillness gripped Frank's heart, its chill sinking deep into his bones. His German shepherd stopped suddenly, ears perked, hackles raised. It sniffed the ground, then looked up at the nest with a low, uneasy growl. Frank's pulse quickened. Something was undeniably wrong. Quickly, he retrieved the ladder he kept strapped to his back for emergencies and propped it against the tree. Climbing cautiously, he prepared himself for the possibility of finding an injured animal, or perhaps a snake that had frightened the birds away. But as he peered into the nest, his breath caught in his throat. The nest was empty, devoid of any birds, eggs, or life. However, there was something there. Something that didn't belong in any nest. Nestled within the twigs and leaves was a small, unmarked object wrapped in black cloth. Frank's mind raced with questions. What was this strange object, and how did it get here? The forest was far from any human residence, so the presence of this object felt intrusive, even sinister. Frank carefully descended, his heart pounding with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He unclipped his radio and called the local police, his voice taut as he tried to explain the gravity of his discovery. To his dismay, the officer on the other end dismissed his concerns, chalking it up to an animal disturbance. But Frank knew better. Something deeper, something darker was happening in his forest. Refusing to be deterred, he took out his phone and snapped pictures of the nest and the mysterious object. Back at the ranger station, he examined the photos closely, hoping to find a clue. But the images only deepened his suspicion. The object was nothing like anything he'd encountered on his patrols. The next morning, he returned to the scene with his German shepherd. As they approached the tree, the dog stopped again, sniffing the ground with fervent curiosity, following an invisible trail. Frank examined the ground around the tree more carefully this time. There, partially hidden beneath the forest debris, were faint markings that looked like scratches, yet they were too precise to be made by any wild animal. It was as if someone, or something, had intentionally left these marks. Driven by instinct, Frank knew he couldn't leave this alone. He decided to dig deeper, to search for more clues. His dog continued to sniff around, leading him away from the tree and toward a thick patch of underbrush nearby. Pushing through the dense vegetation, he spotted a faint trail of footprints leading deeper into the forest. His curiosity overpowered his caution, and he followed the trail with his dog by his side. The trail eventually led him to a secluded clearing. There, hidden among the thick foliage, was another object, a small metal box covered with dirt and leaves, as though someone had attempted to conceal it. Frank knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt, revealing intricate markings on the box's surface. It looked ancient, far too old to belong to anyone from the area. As he examined it, his radio suddenly crackled to life. "Ranger Frank, there's a fire reported near the north end of the park," the dispatcher's voice blared. Frank jolted to his feet, adrenaline surging through him. He hadn't seen any smoke on his patrol, but he couldn't ignore a potential threat to the park. Leaving the box where it was, he called his dog and sprinted toward the north end. When he arrived, however, he found nothing, No smoke, no scorched trees, no sign of a fire. He scoured the area, perplexed by the false alarm. Had someone deliberately sent him away? The unsettling silence of the forest returned, seeping into his bones. His dog seemed equally disturbed, sniffing the ground and circling with an anxious whimper, as though sensing a presence Frank couldn't see. Frustrated and deeply unsettled, Frank returned to the ranger station, his mind racing. The silent nest, the strange object, the markings, the false alarm, none of it made sense. Yet, his instincts told him that all these pieces were connected, fragments of a mystery lurking in the heart of the forest. Determined to unravel it, he set out the following morning, the urgency of discovery pulling him back to the clearing where he'd found the metal box. When he reached the spot, he was shocked to find the box missing. His mind reeled. Someone had been there, someone who knew he had found it. His dog sniffed the ground, catching a new scent that led them deeper into the forest. As they ventured further, Frank felt a shiver run down his spine, a warning from the ancient instincts of survival. Suddenly his dog froze, staring intently ahead, growling low in its throat. Frank looked up and saw a figure in the distance, partially obscured by the trees, watching him. The figure stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, its presence unnaturally still against the backdrop of the forest. Frank's heart raced. He took a cautious step forward, but the figure melted into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Frank's dog barked, pulling at the leash, urging him to follow. But Frank held back, recognizing the danger. Whoever was out there was watching him, waiting. Frank knew he was dealing with something far beyond a routine patrol. The figure, the silent nest, the strange objects, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't meant to solve. But he couldn't turn back now. His instincts, honed over years in the wilderness, urged him forward. With his German shepherd by his side, he moved cautiously, staying close to the tree line and keeping his eyes sharp for any sign of movement. Hours passed as Frank and his dog followed faint trails, disturbed leaves, and broken twigs that hinted at someone, or something, moving through the forest. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, Frank felt the weight of the unknown pressing on him. Just when he thought he'd lost the trail, his dog's nose led them to a hidden path, winding between dense clusters of trees. They reached another clearing, but this one was different. A circle of rocks marked the center, with ash scattered in the middle, as if small fires had been lit here recently. Around the perimeter, Frank noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, intricate shapes that seemed almost ritualistic. A chill ran through him. This was no ordinary campsite or meeting spot. It was a place with a purpose he couldn't yet understand. A rustling sound broke the silence, and Frank turned, his dog growling softly beside him. Emerging from the shadows were two figures, their faces obscured by hoods. They didn't speak, but stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Frank kept his composure, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio, but one of the figures held up a hand, signaling him to stop. "Ranger Frank," the figure said, in a low, gravelly voice. "You've wandered where you don't belong?" Frank's grip tightened on the radio. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice steady but edged with tension. His German shepherd stood poised to defend, teeth bared, sensing the threat. The second figure stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a face weathered by time and shadows. "We protect what the world has forgotten," he said cryptically. "There are things in these woods that must remain hidden. You should have stayed on your path." Despite the threat in his words, Frank couldn't ignore the surge of curiosity that surged within him. "What are you hiding?" he asked, his voice quieter now, laden with a mixture of defiance and intrigue. "I found strange objects in the nest, marks around the trees. This isn't some old secret. It's a threat to the forest, and I won't ignore it." The figures exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Then, in an instant, one of them reached into his cloak, producing a strange whistle. He blew into it, and an eerie, low sound filled the clearing. Frank's dog let out a low whine, momentarily disoriented. Before Frank could react, the figures vanished into the woods, leaving only the echo of that haunting sound lingering in the air. Frank's dog recovered quickly, its loyalty pulling it back to its alert stance. They pressed on, following what little evidence the figures had left behind. As night fell, the forest grew even darker, shadows stretching across the ground like fingers reaching for secrets buried in the soil. Frank knew he should head back to the ranger station, but something about the eerie clearing, the strange men, and the ritualistic symbols compelled him forward. They hadn't gone far when his flashlight illuminated an old, half-buried iron door in the ground, hidden beneath a mound of dirt and leaves. Frank's heart pounded. This had to be the place the figures were protecting, a portal to whatever secrets they had hidden in the forest. Without hesitation, he grabbed a nearby fallen branch and cleared the dirt away, revealing a rusted handle. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay beneath, and pulled. The door groaned open, releasing a wave of stale air. Frank hesitated only a moment before descending into the darkness, his dog at his heels. The narrow passage was cold and damp, walls lined with moss that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. They moved cautiously, the silence of the forest replaced by an ominous, heavy quiet that hung in the air. At the end of the tunnel, they entered a cavernous room filled with shelves, each one lined with strange artifacts, bones, ancient maps, weathered books, and jars filled with murky liquids. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which lay a large, intricately decorated egg, unlike any bird's egg Frank had ever seen. It pulsed with a faint light, casting an eerie glow over the room. Before he could take another step, he heard a voice behind him. "You're in far over your head, Ranger Frank," the voice said, calm yet menacing. Frank turned to see the hooded figure from before, his face now illuminated by the glow of the egg. "This isn't a place for people like you." Frank's heart hammered in his chest, but he stood his ground. "What is this place?" he demanded, gesturing to the bizarre items surrounding them. "What are you hiding here?" The figure stepped forward, his gaze fixated on the glowing egg. "This forest holds many secrets, old and powerful, creatures that don't belong to your world, relics that must be protected from people who would exploit them. We're the keepers, sworn to protect them from prying eyes." Frank felt a mixture of awe and fear. But why the nest? Why plant objects there? The figure's expression darkened. "Sometimes, we must take drastic measures to protect what's sacred. The nest was a warning, a distraction to keep people away while we moved the artifacts to safer places. But you, Ranger Frank, wouldn't leave it alone." Frank's dog growled softly, inching closer to its handler. Frank's gaze flickered to the egg on the pedestal. "And what about that? What is it?" The figure hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A remnant of an ancient creature, a being that once roamed these forests long before humans claimed this land. If it falls into the wrong hands—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Frank understood. This was no ordinary smuggling operation or wildlife trafficking scheme. It was something darker, older, and infinitely more dangerous. The forest he'd spent years protecting was guarding something beyond his comprehension, something powerful enough to alter everything he thought he knew about his world. Frank felt a surge of responsibility. "Then let me help you," he said, surprising even himself with his words. "I know these woods better than anyone. I can help keep these secrets safe." The figure regarded him with a piercing gaze before nodding slowly. "Very well, Ranger Frank, but know that once you've entered this world, there's no going back. You'll see things you cannot unsee, guard secrets you cannot share. The price of knowledge is silence." With a solemn nod, Frank accepted the vow, feeling the weight of his decision settle heavily on his shoulders. He understood that his life would never be the same, but he couldn't turn away. Together with his German shepherd, he followed the figure back through the forest, past the clearing with its strange symbols and the hidden trails. They reached the edge of the forest as dawn broke over the trees, casting a soft glow over the landscape. As Frank stood there, the forest slowly came alive again, its silence lifting, replaced by the familiar sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. From that day forward, Frank became more than a ranger. He was a guardian of the forest's ancient secrets, protector of things both wondrous and dangerous, unseen by the world outside. He continued his patrols with his loyal dog by his side, the two of them forever vigilant, bound by a silent promise to shield the mysteries that lay hidden among the trees. And though he returned to the familiar paths he knew so well, Frank understood that he was now walking between worlds, forever watching over the secrets that belonged only to the forest.